My name is Mona Skolny, and this is the third video in my series on early Staffordshire pottery figures. Early Staffordshire figures are objects of amazing complexity and beauty, but imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, so over time others have mimicked them. Today you find three genres of figures described as having been made in the early 1800s. Some, like the figures you've just seen, are the real thing. They were made in England between 1780 and 1840. Others are reproductions. From the late 1800s, English manufacturers reproduced figures in the style of earlier figures. These figures may now be antique, but they're not the early figures that collectors covet. And yet others are what I dub facsimiles. These offensively ugly objects have been made in China in recent decades. Early Staffordshire figures inspired them, but there all similarity ends. To start, reproductions. Telling an early Staffordshire figure from a repro takes experience, and today we'll climb the learning curve. To train your eye, look at this wedding group celebrating passage of the New Marriage Act of 1823. The careful modelling imparts the animation expected of a group made in the 1820s. Look at the vicar's well-defined curls and the sharp creases in his clothing, and note the expressive face of the clerk on the right, who's apparently imploring the heavens for mercy. The tablecloth has a crisp ruffled edge, and the table has well-defined ball and claw feet. Each paint stroke has been thoughtfully placed. Eyebrows comprise many small strokes rather than harsh unbroken lines. The bride's dress pattern is carefully painted, and the blue and red patterning on the basin pillars has been deliberately placed to give a vermicular effect. The blue tinged glaze confirms early manufacture. Early potters frequently added cobalt to their glaze, and where the glaze is puddled in indentations, you can easily see that bluey tone. Now meet the reproduction group of circa 1900. The modelling is inferior. The vicar's clothing hangs limply, and he no longer has those impressive curls, and the tablecloth needs paint to simulate a ruffled edge. Whereas the characters in the original group are quite comic, here the clumsy modelling and the rather sickly painting of the facial features make them blurred copies of their former selves. On the original plaque, the lettering was impressed into the clay, and then the painter filled in each impression with paint. But on the reproduction, the lettering is so poorly impressed that the inscription appears almost freehand. Again, notice the blue tinged glaze on the original versus the clear glaze on the reproduction. Other pointers will come to you with experience. The green of the man's jacket is not the shade I'd expect on an early figure, and the marbling on the base is the wrong colour for decoration of this type, and it's too clumsily painted. If you think this is all too difficult and you're ready to throw in the towel, let me point out something that never fails to come to my rescue. That network of lines called crazing. On an early figure, crazing is usually very subtle, and the lines typically are perhaps 1/8 of an inch apart. The wide and obvious crazing you see here is a dead giveaway. That wide crazing is also evident under the base. Something else about this base isn't right though. Notice that the rim escaped being glazed. Now look for a moment at the bases of three small early figures. Each has a thick coating of luscious reflective glaze that is tinged blue to a greater or lesser extent. Each rim is fully glazed. This happened when the potter dipped the entire figure into a container of glaze. On the reproduction figure, the glaze is watery and clear. The base's unglazed rim indicates a later manufacturing technique. Not all repro bases have unglazed rims, but if you see one, know you're not looking at an early figure. The only exception would be the unglazed rims on early color glazed figures, as discussed in my second video. The New Marriage Act, like some other figures, was also reproduced in a blue palette. The modelling is better on this example, but all else is wrong. This dandy gentleman and his lady of circa 1815 exhibit that aloof superiority that was mandatory demeanour for the fashionistas of the day. Notice the depth of the glaze and its reflectiveness. If your eye can detect these qualities, you're well on your way to escaping being misled. Here are dandies again made about a century or so later. They are rather frumpy and poor shadows of their former selves. Side by side, the repro does not hold a candle to the real thing. On the early group, look at the crisp modelling of the ruffle on her bonnet, her scarf, his shirt, and those bold buttons on his coat. Notice the finely painted expressions that capture the dandy attitude. Also, the glaze imparts a blue tinge to the white areas. By contrast, the reproduction has a molten look. It's ill-defined and lifeless. The thin, watery glaze is clear, so the white areas appear snowy white. On the early group, the lady's bonnet is adorned with tiny individually crafted flowers, but on the Repro, a clumsy object of sorts has been stuck atop, and on the early group, his basket is topped with leaves and flowers that were pressed from clay one at a time, while on the Repro, it's just a basket. On the early group, the couple's legs are elegantly shaped and their shoes have been decorated with tiny flowers. Similarly, the base is adorned with applied details. On the Repro, the legs are lumpy and mere dabs of paint decorate the base. On the Repro, the bocage, tiny as it is, was formed in the traditional way, but all else about the group would make a potter of the pre-1840 period roll in his grave. Today, inexperienced eye will detect that the glazes and enamels lack depth and luster, and that the color palette is just not right, particularly the greens and the brown on the base, and the manner in which the brown has been applied with an unnatural, streaky, brushed look. Next, a more challenging example. Do you think this deer is real or repro? The frilly clay decoration on the base is typical of early figures, as is the painting of the coat, and the bocage has been modelled from individual leaves in the traditional manner. But nevertheless, this figure is a reproduction. Here it stands alongside a genuine figure made 60 or so years earlier. Figures of this type have until recently fooled experts, but now we're all older and wiser. Pointers to the later date for the repro deer include that shade of green on the bocage. Also, while the bocage on the early deer has a natural curvature and depth, the repro bocage is very rigid, flat, and one-dimensional. From beneath, the repro deer is fully glazed, but the glaze is thin with no hint of color, so the surface is very white. The crazing is suitably subtle, but the lines are wide, not unheard of on an early figure, but certainly not the norm. In my early collecting years, I made a mistake with a repro figure of this type. I bought this fox from an established dealer who'd bought it out of a renowned collection. It too has a flat, awkward bocage and a too-white body, but look at the flowers on the bocage. I've yet to see those round flowers painted half blue and half red on an early figure, and yes, they are the same flowers we saw on the reproduction deer. We see those same flowers again on these repro sheep, so if you see these very flowers on a figure, know that it's not an early figure. On these sheep, don't miss the other typical repro features, including the minty green color, that flat bocage, and the streaky brown, all typical of later figures. What could be more convincing than a printed mark beneath a figure? Printed marks may read Made in England, Old Staffordshire Ware, or something of the sort, but if you see a printed mark, you are looking at a later figure. Maker's marks on early figures are uncommon. When present, they are invariably impressed into the clay. A potter named John Walton made this group circa 1825. He titled it Tenderness, and he impressed Walton on the reverse. Walton made this model with more than one bocage form, as you see here. Both groups are marked Walton in the same manner. A third group positioned on the right resembles a genuine one in the middle, but although also marked Walton, it is a reproduction made around 70 years later. Notice the titling on the early groups. The letters have serifs, those strokes on the ends, but on the reproduction group the letters lack serifs. Similarly, on the early group the Walton mark has serifs. Notice how the letters are deeply impressed and the bluish glaze is puddled in the indentations. In contrast, on the reproduction the mark is poorly impressed and lacks serifs, and the thin clear glaze reveals a very white body beneath. On the early group the bocage has a dimensional quality, a slight curve and some spacing that impart depth, but on the repro the bocage appears to have been flattened with a rolling pin. On the reproduction, coarse, wide crazing jumps out to meet you. You wouldn't see such crazing on an early example. I never fail to look beneath the figure. On the early example there's no obvious crazing and the glaze has a lovely blue tinge and some depth, while the repro is markedly crazed and the glaze is thin and clear. On the reproduction, notice the minty green on the bocage, which points to a later date. And because the modelling and decoration leave much to be desired, and because the glaze is watery and lustrous, the repro appears quite dreary next to the real thing. A name has a certain cachet, so other Walton repros were made. This pair of circa 1900 has the Walton name on the reverse, but the letters are poorly impressed and nearly all lack serifs. The originals are rather clumsy, not Walton's finest work by any means, so the modelling of the repro figures is not too far off the mark, but you will recognise other pointers to later manufacture. The two white bodies with a glaze that looks too thin, those very flat bocages, and the same flowers that we saw earlier on the deer, sheep and fox are on the girl's bocage. Because the devil is in the details, I draw your attention to the flowers on the boy's bocage. These appear integral to the bocage leaves, whereas on early figures flowers were usually applied separately and they stand away from leaves just a little. You'll see flowers of this form on other repros such as this tithe pig group. Yet again, notice the poor modelling, the flat bocage and the wrong greens. Repro tithe pig groups are common and there is more than one model. One with pink flowers occurs frequently and even a blue and white version is known. But here we see the real thing, with refined modelling, a typical colour palette and a rich glaze. Now a test of your knowledge. Which figure was made circa 1815 and which circa 1900? First clue. The man on the left has a wooden expression devoid of animation, and the same can be said of his dog. Notice how thin and lustreless the glaze is, and as your eye wanders down, you can't fail to notice the too white body, the streaky brown on the base, and most importantly, the large crazing. The early figure on the right, however, has a lovely blue tinged glaze that is easily seen where it has puddled. Would you say the cobbler Jobson and his wife Nell were made nearer 1820 or 1920? You only have to look at the very obvious wide lines of crazing to have your answer. And look at how the modelling compares to that on an earlier figure. A wide array of repro figures of this genre exists. The martyred Saint Sebastian occurs all too frequently, sometimes with an impressed maker's mark. Also, the Leeds pottery in Yorkshire made figures in around 1900 that are impressed Leeds pottery. This sheep, so marked beneath, is well modelled, but the bocage is of a form not used at an earlier date. I hope you recognise the too white body and too flat glaze as indicative of later manufacture. Also, the dimple beneath points to a different manufacturing technique. Before we leave repros, I must warn you of this bull baiting group made well into the 20th century that auction houses frequently catalogue as early. Just 7 or so inches across, it is an inferior reduced scale form of this much larger beauty, measuring 14 inches across and made early in the 19th century. Finally, let's discuss facsimiles. In the last century, Staffordshire figures were nearly always pictured in black and white. The first all-colour publication in 1990 inspired a Chinese manufacturer to emulate the glory he saw, and that trend continues till today. This very group was mimicked by copying a single photograph of it. It commemorates the famous boxing match of 1824 between Thomas Spring and Jack Langan. Each boxer's name is impressed beside him, and Walton, the mark of the maker, is on the reverse. Just 7 inches high, it oozes the men's pugnacious spirit. And here's a facsimile. Rather than being Spring and Langan, the pugilists have now become Sping with 2 P's and Cangham. But other differences hit you in the eye. The facsimile is large, crude, chunky, heavy, and just plain ugly. Like other facsimiles, it's routinely marketed as Staffordshire, but facsimiles weren't made in Staffordshire. They're Asian. Also, they're often touted as antique, but they aren't antique by any definition of the word. The differences between early Staffordshire figures and Asian facsimiles are obvious to all but the blind, but those who haven't encountered the real thing are routinely deceived. So let's pinpoint those differences. Facsimiles are always thickly potted and surprisingly heavy. Bases often have thick rims, the likes of which I've yet to see on an early Staffordshire figure. The crazing here is fine, but some of it's been stained to simulate age. Notice the men's bodies have been dirtied to suggest great age, and notice their Asian expressions. The facsimile doesn't hold a candle to the bright, beautiful original. Its modelling is so crude, and the box's legs are one with the stumps behind them. It took more than twice as many moulds to fashion the early example. Next, we look at Elijah and the Widow, made circa 1820. As you'd expect, the bocages are delicate structures comprising many tiny leaves, and each figure has been finely painted. Numerous details throughout result from using very many separate molded parts. Look at the carefully molded ewer at her feet and the flowers applied to the base one by one. These are the facsimiles. The bocages, seen here from the front and back, are merely messy clumps of clay. Facial features are rather oriental. Each figure was made out of as few molded parts as possible, so the decorative flowers are integral to the base. And notice how that once beautiful ewer has become a chunky teapot of sorts. To simulate age, there's much scuffing and staining, and if you look beneath, the crazing has been darkened to look old. I've yet to see such dirty crazing on even the dirtiest genuine figure. For our last example, we look at what some consider the ultimate, an early Staffordshire Pottery menagerie. Menageries were zoos on wheels that roamed Britain, and this example of around 1835 depicts the colourful exterior that greeted visitors then. Menageries are rare, and 3 were portrayed in colour in publications in around 1990. They differ, but all needed very many moulds to fashion their small individual elements. The birds and monkeys on the top and each little person on the platform were all made from multiple individual moulds. China's attempt is quite laughable really, yet you can readily find examples online. Some claim to be antique, others modestly claim only vintage status. Whereas the real thing is about 14 inches tall, this little beast is a mere 8 or so inches. That dark crazing is a large red flag, and if you look at the back and beneath, you see the same deliberate dirting, plus the base has a broad unglazed rim. Case closed. But what if you discovered this menagerie lurking in a junk shop? It has no visible crazing. Would you be fooled? As you see, it's a lookalike of the stained menagerie, but both are facsimiles. Let's look for other telltale signs common to both groups. Notice how all the musicians in the center of the platform on the early group are individually modeled figures, while on both facsimiles the figures were modeled as part of the backdrop. The same can be said of the monkeys and birds atop the backdrop and the 3 lanterns lighting the entrance. On the original, these are separate elements. On the facsimile, they're integral to the backdrop. On the real thing, the figures appear European, but on the facsimiles, the people have Asian features. Other differences abound, but by now you have, I hope, turned your back on the facsimiles. Again, I am Myrna Skolny, and you can learn more about early Staffordshire figures by reading my books. Please visit my website, mystaffordshirefigures.com, which provides a wealth of information and a free download of my latest book titled Obsession. My help is always free, so if you have questions or need advice, please email me at this address. You have just watched the 3rd video in my series on early Staffordshire pottery figures, and I hope you'll want to watch the others too.